I must say, after listening to the presentations this morning, and particularly Glenn's, I guess I have to fess up to being fat, 60-something or other, and in my wildest fantasies, not too obnoxious. Look, I'd also like to thank Mike for pointing out our mission statement. There are certain organisations in the history of business life that have changed the world. One of them very easy to think about is Apple. So Apple gave us the ability to not have to carry around cassettes that didn't work when we were trying to jog, to be able to carry all of our music library and nowadays our book library in our pocket. So this notion of organisations who make a contribution to changing the world, that is our goal. That has been our mission statement now for 1 month short of 10 years. It was December 2004 that we established that global mission statement. And it really is about, I mean, we know that constructive, highly constructive organisations are more socially conscious, they are more socially responsible, they are more environmentally conscious and environmentally responsible, and they are more human conscious and human responsible. So they understand, you put that together, it means they understand that they have a role to play in society, not just making widgets or generating electricity or building a motorway in a tunnel or providing social welfare services to the citizens of the country and so on and so forth. It really is about what is our contribution, what is the importance of how we make that contribution to society. And that then impacts on everything that is consequent to that, like environment, like social responsibility, like fiscal responsibility, etc. So it's capable of being extremely powerful. So we made a very conscious decision that we would like to set ourselves the goal of changing the world from that perspective, but we can really only do it one at a time. If we can have one more organisation become just a little bit more constructive in both the ways in which the individual leaders behave and the way in which the behavioural expectations exist within the organisation, and they become, to use a simplistic phrase, a little bit more constructive, or in some cases a lot more constructive, then we know that we have helped contribute to a world that is going to make what is probably the best, but not a perfect by any stretch of the imagination, economic model work for us. I mean, there are treatises being written about democracy being in its dying throes, that capitalism hasn't worked. The GFC was a very good illustration of that. And in fact, the GFC is an excellent illustration of how aggressive defensive behaviours change the world. I mean, you basically had banks lending money that they never had in the first place to people who couldn't afford to pay it back. And so eventually that catches up with itself. And so those organisations were not by any stretch of the imagination being socially conscious and socially responsible. And so they put their own customers in a position where collapse was the only inevitable outcome from that. So thank you for pointing this out. It's a very important mission to us. And if we can help one organisation become just that little bit more constructive, to use that term, and therefore have all of those attributes associated with that, then so much the better. So, two very simple propositions that I'd like to put in front of you as I proceed through some fairly hefty data. I mean, I was absolutely intrigued to see Michelle's. This is the first time I've seen the presentation. To see his data, because I am first and foremost a data freak. I got into this because I am a scientist in my heart from 40 years ago, and I've now been involved with Human Synergistics since 1978, however long that is. It's probably longer than a lot of you have been alive. So two very simple propositions. Your ability to respond is all in your mind, and having known the tone of what Glenn was going to present on, I thought that would be a good representation of that. And I'm very familiar with the work that the MSD folks have been doing through our Wellington office here with Frank. Least familiar with the Meridian, although I did have the pleasure of attending a workshop with their executive group. And again, as Mike said, a very constructive CEO goes a long way in helping this whole process. But looking at the presentations that were going to happen, I felt that these were two reasonable propositions to put in front of you. That for you personally, your ability to adapt is all in your mind, and for your organisation, the ability of your organisation to respond is all in your people's mind. So when thinking about the whole notion of unlocking the ability to respond, I felt resilience was as good a word as any to try and capture that. And so we're looking at how we can help build personal and social resilience in you at the individual level, in your work group at the group level, and in your organisation at that total org level. So again, you sort of plunge for the dictionary with these kind of things to make sure that you actually think you know what you're talking about at least. And these are some common definitions of the notion of resilience. So it's the ability to recall and spring back into shape, or of a person being able to withstand or recover quickly. At the organisational level, these are various definitions that are on the, God bless the internet, another world-changing event. Ability to adapt to changing situations, bounce back again, adapt, respond quickly, decisively and effectively, etc. And in a scientific journal, I found one that I felt very comfortable with. And it is the property of a material that enables it to resume its original shape or position after being bent, stretched or compressed, otherwise known as elasticity. And interesting, that word elasticity, because it's been borrowed by the neuroscience people, particularly with David Rock's neuroscience leadership, with this notion around neuroplasticity, in terms of the ability of the various neurons within the brain to physically interact with each other to create some sort of outcome. And so it was the word property that drew me to that particular definition, because that's what we're about essentially. We are essentially about measuring properties for the human condition at the individual level. So it's either how individuals think. So for those unfamiliar, that's often referred to as the Lifestyles Inventory 1, LSI 1. How people behave, the flip side of that, the LSI 2. How managers and leaders cause other people to think and behave. So that's the notion of impact that you have on others. How groups behave, and how people believe in the organisations that they are expected to behave. So you had a very good illustration of organisational shifts with Brendan, and goodness knows I've known Brendan for a very, very long time, way back to Public Registries Group in, heaven forbid, I think it was about the mid-1980s. And so you see a very good illustration there of organisational level change to create these different beliefs around how people are expected to behave. So just some bits and pieces around the circumplex and how that stuff works. So this will probably be additional stuff for those that know it, and clearly new for those that don't. But these three clusters, I mean, it's very complex. The three clusters are made up of 12 styles. And I have to say, it's an enormous achievement of a very complex goal, that circumplex. When Dr. J. Clayton Lafferty in 1973, so I came along 5 years later in 78, when Clay developed this circumplex, he was looking to synthesise a whole bunch of thinking about human behaviour, and it's particular in human behaviour within organisations. And so it is just that, it's a synthesis of various ways of looking at the human condition, if you like. But what he wanted to do, and this is the goal that I think has been quite extraordinary, is he wanted to develop something that was simple enough for an everyday line manager who doesn't want all that sort of psychobabble bullshit stuff to look at and understand, right? But on the other hand, complex enough for a professor of organisational behaviour to be able to use for research purposes. And as you saw in one of the introductory slides that Pam put up a couple of hours ago, I think it's something like 495 universities in the United States use our tools for research and teaching purposes. And we get all that data. So we've got 495 researchers out there that aren't on our payroll, if you like, that are doing all of this analysis that help us improve and build and develop and utilise the strength in the tools. So they're two very contrasting goals. Something that an everyday person could look at and say, okay, I understand what's going on there, through to something that a bunch of academics can pull apart and play with. So again, just looking at it at these three cluster levels to keep it relatively straightforward, we know that all the stuff on optimism, if you're familiar with Seligman's work on learned optimism, for instance, that people who are in the constructive zone, if you like, whether it's an individual, a group or an organisation, they tend to approach challenges with a view of optimism. And it's very, very interesting, the whole study of optimism, because one of the items in the LSI inventory, as an example, is actually optimistic and realistic. So the LSI uses what's called the adjectival descriptive method. So it's an adjective. How descriptive is that of you? Or if I'm describing Joel, how descriptive would I say that is of Joel? And it's been very, very funny over the years, I have to say, watching people who are neither optimistic nor realistic have arguments with me about what a stupid item that is. So how can you be optimistic and realistic at the same time? Which suggests they really don't understand the notion of optimism. Right? So we know that constructive people are optimistic and confident about challenges. We know that when people operate in those passive defensive zones, which we all do at times, right? I mean, if your proverbial hits the fan today, one of your ways of coping with that will be to slip into passive behaviour. Right? It's now a question of whether it remains a constant coping style of behaviour for you, or it's a here and now in the moment coping mechanism. But we know that people that function in that sort of area, that cluster, lack confidence and have a mild sense of helplessness. And on the other hand, the aggressive defensive stuff is all about this overconfidence but anxiety about things. And here's the reason why. It's really quite simple. The constructive thing, so you see this, you see examples of this in what people talk about, and particularly in Glenn's personal story, because that's something that we can all relate to, very, very personal story, is that operating in the constructive zone is about, I can tell the difference between what I can control and what I can't control. There are some things that I simply cannot control, but what I can control is how I respond to that. So it's the ability to identify the difference. People operating in the passive defensive zone get caught up in this, I am but a leaf in the wind kind of mentality. Right? And people in the aggressive defensive zone get caught up on, I should be in control of everything. And the key word there is should. There's one very famous psychological researcher about 70 years called them the famous imperatives. The shoulds, the have-tos, the ought-tos, these imperatives that drive us. Okay? So when we put that into how an organisation functions, we can see as a consequence of that thinking what's running around inside people's head. In the constructive zone, it's about managing uncertainty, whereas in the passive defensive zone, it's about avoiding uncertainty and risk. And in the aggressive defensive zone, it's actually about going out and finding it and seeking it and getting that buzz out of it, but then not actually responding to it too well when it happens. So then when we look at the economic viability of organisations over time, and we do these studies, we do typically 5 to 7 year studies of industries and organisations, etc., is we see that the more the culture and the leadership is around in that constructive area, the more sustainable over time is the economic performance, and therefore the organisation, the more vulnerable and the more volatile. So it's up and down. And we've done that with share prices, we've done it with revenue figures and all sorts of things. So let's come back to resilience. Again, I looked through the literature, and in fact I did this some years back around some resilience work that I did. And these are very common sort of aspects of individual resilience that you find in the literature. And I put at the bottom the comment, it's quite intriguing, because one way or another, by sheer coincidence if you like, they actually describe the 4 constructive styles, albeit there's 5 bullet points there, the first 2 to describe the achievement style. So for an individual to be resilient, there needs to be a belief that my personal effort can make a difference. So at some stage, Glenn had to take a big deep breath and say, I can do something about this. Right? That in times of crisis, an organisation that provides electrical services that's very dependent on the weather has to make a decision. Where can my effort make a difference? Likewise with Ministry of Social Development, likewise with University of Canterbury. The ability to distinguish what you can and what you can't. Awareness of your own abilities, that's the self-actualising stuff at 12 o'clock in the circumplex. So you're aware of your own strengths and weaknesses. You're not perfect. So therefore, where do you need to focus your efforts around that? Support from those around you, because it's very difficult to do things all on your own. And this is one of the interesting things about cause and effect with behaviour, because as you will have picked up again, if I can refer back to Glenn's personal profiles, when you behave, or when people perceive you behaving very aggressively towards them, are they going to support you? Probably not. Okay? So you end up actually killing off your own support through those sorts of behaviours. And again, you need somebody that you can rely on, depend on, that you can cry on their shoulder, that you can talk to them, whatever it might be. You need somebody that's close to you to be able to do that stuff. So I want to present some data, much of which is in this book that Pam referred to that is early on in her presentation right at the introduction. I'm going to show you some of the slides and graphs that are in that book to give you a sense of what that book says. Because that book is a very determined effort to create cause and effect within the data in terms of this is the cause and what is the effect. Okay? So I'll try and keep it not academic, if you like. So the first is the impact of thinking styles on personal effectiveness. So again, you saw a personal story around that kind of thing from Glenn's frame in terms of the impact of that way of thinking on him. But how we think, our self-concept, influences our sense of self-efficacy, our satisfaction at work, and our satisfaction with relationships and life in general. Just look at it this way. Every action is preceded by a thought. Everything we do is a consequence of something that runs around inside our head. So if we're unhappy with some aspect of our life, it's because somewhere along the line our thinking about that is not aligned with our desires, our goals, and all the rest of it. So here's the sort of data that we play with. This has taken 3 years of LSI in Australia and New Zealand. We combine the Australian and New Zealand data because we work for so many organisations that operate trans-Tasman. And despite some of the popularist literature you might read, there are not that many differences between Australians and New Zealanders that you might believe that there are. Right? We have a lot of scientific data about that. Again, it's easy to write popular stuff about Australians are very aggressive and all that kind of stuff. And actually, let me tell you, it's actually the reality is that Australians are just a smidgen more aggressive than we are, but we are a smidgen more passive than they are. So when you put the two together, they might like a lot. I mean, to me, the only real difference is in the tall poppy syndrome. Australia believes they have one. And I keep saying to them, you don't know what it bloody will look like until you've worked in New Zealand for 40 years. Right? And here's what happens. I mean, if there's a headline in the newspaper about Sydney that says Sydney is the greatest capital in the world, then for the next week the headlines will be, yeah, Sydney is the greatest capital in the world. But I think it was earlier this year or late last year, I can't remember when, some overseas organisation rated Wellington as the best little capital in the world. Can you remember what the headline the next morning was? Are we really? Therein lies one of the differences. So back to the data. So what we did was we took, I think it was about 47,000 sets of LSI data. And this is the LSI 1, the thinking. And so we took the 10% most constructive and the 10% least constructive. So that's the two profiles here. So roughly 4,700 people's LSI 1s averaged up looking like the left-hand one, and 4,700 people ended up looking like the right-hand one. So we now have the cause, the thinking. So now we want to see is what is the difference in the outcomes between those that display very constructive thinking versus those that display very defensive thinking. Now, one of the important notions of self-concept or components of self-concept is what's called self-efficacy. Right? Self-efficacy is a belief that I have some capability, that I'm good at doing something, whether it's good at knitting, whether it's good at standing up on a stage and talking to people, whether it's good at doing Excel spreadsheets, whether it's good at doing God only knows what it is. It doesn't matter. Part of psychological health is to have a belief that I'm okay, I'm pretty good at what I do kind of stuff, right? And again, it's not blinkered. But so here's the difference. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, it's not just a little, it's a hell of a lot. The most constructive thinking individuals see themselves better in their jobs to a factor of 75% than those with most defensive thinking. And the interpersonal side of it's 86%. We look at the relationship between, again, just the profiles don't change. It's just further data around that most constructive and least constructive. So this time around, how satisfied are those people at work? And look at the differences. So we know, and again we know with longitudinal studies, is that if people start to develop constructive ways of thinking, then they deal with issues more constructively. That's why we chose that word. I mean, 40 years ago, it was a word that people did not use. Now it's an everyday language. You dealt with that very constructively. Right? And so that's, again, part of an impact that we've been able to have over a very, very long period of time. We know that the more people develop constructive ways of thinking about themselves and their world around them, the more satisfied they are with their job. The more satisfied they are, by the way, with a number of aspects of their personal life. So their ability to handle stress, they believe, is much stronger. Their leisure time activities, they feel more satisfied with that. They feel more satisfied with their family life, their physical health, and their general state of mind. And so those are about quality of thinking. So the leisure time activities does not mean to say they get to play golf 7 days a week. It just means when they do get to play golf, they really enjoy it, because they have the ability to not think about work all the way around the golf links, or not think about work as they do that 10K jog in the morning, because they can switch off and reflect, and as a very current phrase puts it, be mindful. Okay? So we look at the flip side, the LSI2, the impact of behavioural styles on others' perceptions of your effectiveness. So how we behave, and again, you saw a very good illustration of that with Glenn. How you behave towards others causes others to rate in their own mind, whether it's in some process or otherwise, doesn't matter. They think about you, rate your effectiveness, and it influences how they go about that. So this is now, again, the same 47,000 managers and leaders, and we look for the most constructive LSI2 profiles and the most defensive or least constructive LSI2 profiles. So again, 4,700, 4,700, and here, there is the perceived effectiveness scores. So the more constructive you are, the more people say, yeah, she's good at doing a job, and yeah, he's okay to work with, kind of stuff. But also they say, and he's a little less stressed than some of the other people around here, better at managing time, and seems to be a little bit more satisfied in his or her job. So not only does the change in the way of thinking and behaving impact your own sense of satisfaction with a number of aspects of your life, is it actually impacts on how others see that satisfaction. Okay? Interesting. The shift to the organisational level. This is where, again, I'm just going to use some bullet points and some probably poorly constructed slides to try and give you a sense of cause and effect. Okay? So when we talk about organisational resilience, we use words like adaptability, innovation, proactivity. But these are outcomes. It's very important to see those as outcomes. You may set out with the goal to make your organisation more innovative or more adaptable or more proactive, but it's what do you do to get that? So they're outcomes. So you don't become more innovative, you do certain things and become something else that makes you more innovative. And so typically, when you look at the research behind innovation, proactivity and that kind of thing, is it comes down to elements like this, that the organisation needs to have cooperation rather than competition. Internally, I'm talking about. So Mike talked about the external competition. I mean, he talked about competition, creating great outcomes, etc. That's all about competing with those other guys out there. Here we're talking about competing against each other internally. Right? And so we know innovation cannot happen unless there is what's called cross-functional cooperation. Because otherwise, the people who design this bit don't talk to the people who design this bit, so when this bit goes together with this bit, it rattles, or whatever. Okay? And if you want to read case studies on that, they abound in the literature. One of the best of them is Microsoft. Right? Inter-unit coordination, so coordinating the efforts across the organisation. Open, unfiltered upwards communication. In other words, what gets to me as a CEO is actually the truth, not what my manager thinks I want to hear, not what one of my direct reports thinks I want to hear. And downward communication emphasises learning rather than blame. And of course, you've got to have motivated, engaged people to get much out of anybody anyway. So that's a bit of a summary. It's very much a summary of what the research illustrates, and I'd focus very much upon the first four to create innovation and adaptation. But they in turn, interestingly enough, are outcomes of something else, and they're outcomes of the organisation's operating culture. And so here's a proposition. Your organisation's culture is the best predictor of your organisation's ability to respond. Because we've done those studies. We've compared them to other predictors. It's actually the best predictor of long-term performance, according to a number of very, very good studies. So I just want to then step back for a moment and make sure that we're talking the same stuff. So what do we mean by organisations' culture? So this is the definition of culture that we work to, and this is the definition that is now quoted in numerous organisational behaviour university textbooks. Organisational culture is the shared values, norms and expectations that govern the way people approach their work and interact with each other. A number of very important components in there. The essence is around what we call the shared norms. So culture is about normative behaviour. Culture is about how people believe they are expected to behave in order to get things done. So when something goes wrong with a wind turbine at 2 o'clock in the morning and it's blowing at 120 kilometres an hour, what do I believe I am expected to do? So that's a very good illustration of culture that Mike gave, in terms of those are very tricky decisions to make. And what we know is the organisation's culture very, very much influences how people make decisions. So to not make it too technical, when we talk about the way people approach their work and interact with each other, this is what we mean by approach their work. So how do they solve problems, make decisions, how do they respond to crises, respond to goals, deadlines, and all that kind of stuff. And interacting with each other, working in teams, work between teams, share information, build relationships, respond to authority. No great rocket science there. That's what goes on at all times within an organisation. So as somebody once said, and I think it's not a bad line, your culture becomes very clear when people don't think anybody's watching. So when people aren't watching, how do people behave? That's going to be indicative of your culture. I'm going to show you a very brief video. The quality is appalling. It's an old 1960s candid camera clip, but you'll get the point.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door, everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
It's no better illustration of the reality of social norms. So it's what do you believe is expected of you as being part of this group. That's how culture works in organisations. So it's how people believe they are expected to behave in order to fit in and get ahead, and at times in some organisation cultures simply survive. So the notion of behavioural norms is very important, as opposed to how individuals behave or how you might even look at how groups behave, because this is the expectations that the system is placing upon people. It's not just another word for climate or employee engagement, it's actually at the fundamental core of the organisation, which is why you see such dramatic differences between constructive and defensive styles when you look at management and organisational culture data. So again, we look at some data. This is a random selection out of a 2,000 organisation data set for Australia and New Zealand. I think it was 297 organisations it turned out to be. And we took the top 10% of that 297 in terms of constructive and the bottom 10% in terms of the least constructive and therefore by definition the most defensive. And we look at some of the outcomes associated with that. 3 levels of outcomes we measure: individual, group and organisation. So this is the individual stuff. So in the more constructive organisations, the staff are 26% more satisfied, 32% more motivated, 19% greater role clarity, understanding what they're supposed to be doing, and they're 26% less stressed. So we can see that the culture determines how committed and engaged your people are. Coming back to that, the ability to respond is in the minds of your people. At the group level, outcomes are teamwork. So how well does our team work together? 28% better. How well do we communicate across teams? Inter-unit coordination, 30% better. And how well do we do our jobs, do we believe? Called departmental quality, 25%. So we now see that the culture determines how effectively subgroups are integrated. And this is absolutely critical. It's what most organisations fail to see. So everybody knows about silo mentality, right? It's that commonly used. If you have a siloed organisation, by definition, you do not have integrated subunits. And if you do not have integrated subunits, it's basically a big version of the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So we look at the organisational level outcomes. Again, the same top and bottom 10% for culture. Organisational level quality, how well is the organisation performing in providing its service and products to its customers, whether they are a government organisation or a commercial enterprise, and how adaptable do we believe the organisation is to changes in its external environment. So there has been a truckload of research done, particularly on that last one, between the relationship of the organisation's culture and its ability to adapt, because the culture enables adaptation to take place. So the third point is your culture determines the quality of service and ability to adapt. Another important point that we devote a whole chapter to in that book is that culture is not about strategy. Culture is about execution of the strategy. So you see a Ministry of Social Development striving for blue, right? Read in brackets a constructive culture and leaders and managers who behave in constructive ways. You see a university doing it. You see an electricity generator do it. You see an individual do it, as well as part of a program for an engineering infrastructure type of organisation doing it. So they're all going for blue. But important to keep in mind that these are what's called generic styles. So I'm high in achievement, she's high in achievement. That does not mean to say we're exactly the same. I might use my achievement differently the way in which she uses her achievement, but it's still achievement. It's goal-focused, it's goal-oriented, it's cause and effect-oriented, it's planned, it's thinking of alternatives before acting, etc. So the way in which a Meridian may use constructive styles may well be slightly different to the way in which a university will use constructive styles, but they're still constructive styles. So it's not about your strategy or what industry you're in, it's about how effectively you execute that strategy. So again, there's lots of data to support that hypothesis in the book. So this is the way that we do it. When we do a culture survey, we ask often just a small population, maybe the executive group or something like that, to complete an ideal culture survey or a preferred culture survey. So here's the survey. Score the items to the extent to which these behaviours should be encouraged in your organisation, as opposed to the actual culture survey as to what extent are these behaviours encouraged in your organisation. And so we see in the manufacturing sector, the collective data we have seems to indicate that those people think a constructive culture is going to help them achieve their objectives a little better. So then we take the most constructive organisations, top 10% constructive in that data set, and the bottom 10%, so the most constructive, least constructive within manufacturing, and we look at the outcomes. So that we can see in manufacturing, for instance, we take a good one, employee advocacy, For those organisations there, their employee advocacy scores are 19% higher than those organisations. 13% higher satisfaction levels amongst their staff. We do it for the technology industry. So again, the collective, what do you think culture should be like in order for you to best achieve your objectives? The most constructive in that data set and the least constructive, and this is their outcome. So now you have, in this particular industry, which is very human dependent, it's all about brains, now employee advocacy, there's a 42% difference between the most constructive and the least constructive. So hands up those who don't want their engagement score to go up by 42%. So it's really that simple. Financial services, so banks and insurance companies, the same equation. That's the aggregate of what they said they think they should have, their ideal, and then the most constructive, least constructive, and this is the outcome data for that industry. In local government, city councils, etc. Again, 26% difference in employee advocacy, 25% difference in view of the organisation as being externally adaptive, etc. So those outcomes are very strong. So why, I mean, one way of thinking about this is to answer this question, why is culture so impactful? So here's just a story in pictures, if you like, around this. Just a conceptual organisation chart. It's got a CEO of some description, a bunch of senior executives, a bunch of below them, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? So to fit it all on one slide, it really only goes down 3 levels. Now, an organisation is made up of a number of relationships. So relationship number 1 is the obvious one. Me and my team, managing director and the leadership team, the marketing general manager and his or her marketing leadership team, etc. There's also the strategic team relationship. So the way we collectively work together to run a function or a business unit. The third type of relationships at the tactical level. So these teams are meeting in teams of 5 to 7, maybe 20 or whatever, working on issues. And then there's the cross-functional team relationships. So generally speaking, there are 4 types of relationships that take place in the organisation. Now, I've very purposely made that slide very messy because organisations are very messy. In fact, an organisation is an unorganised combination of relationships. Right? That's the definition of an organisation in a very, very good book that was written by a woman called Bonnie McDaniel Douglas in about 1981, I think it was. Right? Excellent book. An organisation is an unorganised combination of relationships. Now, interestingly, when you talk of the word relationships to many senior executives, their notion of relationship falls mildly short of sex. The relationship is all about getting on, having fun together, being nice to each other. It's not what relationships are about. Definition of a relationship is about how people collectively arrive at the decisions that they make. That's what makes a relationship. So when your relationship personally is not working so well, is because you're not making decisions together very well. In fact, you're possibly not even talking to each other to make those decisions. When your relationship's working really well, you're making decisions the same way, perhaps together. Okay? So we need to think about that definition of the organisation as an unorganised combination of relationships, is an unorganised way in which people throughout the organisation go about making decisions. And so what characterises a great working relationship? And there are 7 characteristics of a good working relationship. And they're all fairly obvious. Again, there's no great rocket science here. The first is trust. The second is respect. The third is willingness to voice and accept constructive differences. So if I disagree with you, I will disagree with it. I just don't do it at the 99th percentile red. I'll do it at the 75th percentile constructive. Commitment to a common goal. Willingness to be accountable, clarity of roles, objectives and expectations, and lack of ego. If you have those 7 things going on in any relationship in your life, whether it is with your life partner, your children, your parents, your manager, your direct reports and or your team, then you will have a strong relationship in terms of that definition of how people go about making decisions. So it's the organisation's culture that influences how these relationships work, either to the organisation's advantage or to the organisation's disadvantage. Let me show you one of my favourite quotes about organisational culture. This is a prolific American academic, Edgar Schein, who has written tons of books around organisational culture. If you do not manage culture, it manages you. And you may not even be aware of the extent to which this is happening. So it's very interesting, for instance, I mean, culture is becoming a bit of a buzzword at the moment. When somebody interviews a sports person or something, and they say, well, you know, we're building a culture. Well, you've already got a culture, right? You get two people together for 5 minutes, you've got a culture. So the question is, what are you building in the way of a different culture, and how are you going about doing that? So what happens when relationships aren't great? So what happens when you don't have trust is you have lack of confidence in each other. When you don't have respect, you have lack of commitment to the decision. Because, I mean, I don't respect you, I'm not going to think that that's a brilliant decision that you've come up with. If we don't have willingness to voice, accept differences in a constructive way, then we now have superficial relationships and an adequate exploration of data. If we don't have commitment to a common goal, we have self-interest and competing priorities. If we don't have willingness to be accountable, we have low standards and avoidance of responsibility. If we don't have clarity of roles, we have unnecessary conflict and avoidance of blame. So it's unnecessary, simply because I didn't understand, we see the world differently. And if you don't have lack of ego, then you have internal competition and blaming of others. Right? And for those that know the circumplex and the colours associated with those three clusters, there's no coincidence that some of them are green and some of them are red. Because some of them represent passive defensive behaviours and some of them represent aggressive defensive behaviours. So right back at the very beginning of the presentation, I said the requirements for an organisation to be proactive, adaptive and innovative is about these 5 bullet points. Well, if you've got all that stuff going on that's behind that, then that stuff's simply not going to happen. And you're not going to be proactive, you're going to be reactive. You're not going to be adaptable, you'll be constantly putting out fires. You're not going to be innovative, you're simply going to be trying to react to catch up time and time again. So that's but one example of why culture is so impactful, because if all that dysfunctional stuff's going on, people are not focusing on what's really important to the organisation. That's focusing on excellence and performing at a high level. So there's lots of stuff written around the relationship between leadership and culture. And so again, we want to take the opportunity in that book to give you some evidence around that based on a couple of our particular tools that have not been referred to this morning. But this notion of leadership, this diagram has been used a lot since I developed it, I don't know, 20 years ago. The notion of the reinforcing impact of leadership and culture and together impacting on performance. So leadership influences culture and culture in turn influences leadership. So change is about intervening at both levels, if you like. So let's look at the so-called leadership culture connection. So what is the relationship between the way leaders lead and the culture that gets developed in their organisation? So firstly, there's the direct impact. So this is what you've seen with LSI. So personal styles, how I think, how I behave, how I go about leading people, how I go about managing people, that kind of stuff. So how do I work with you to set a goal? How do I work with you to solve a problem? How do I talk about the future and the vision for the business? All this kind of leadership and management stuff. But there's also an indirect impact that leaders have through the decisions that they make around articulation of values and mission, how they structure the organisation, the organisational systems, particularly human resources systems that they used, because HR systems reward and or punish certain behaviours. Okay? The job design, so levels of autonomy and that kind of stuff, and how we communicate up and down and sideways in the organisation. So to give you an illustration of the direct impact that leaders have, here's a little bit of a complex graph for you to get your head around at this late stage of the morning. There's another tool that we have called Leadership Impact, which says, Shaun, how do you go about all these leadership things, one of which is influencing? Right? So there's 10 of them. One of them's influencing. And what sort of behaviours would you like to promote in your team? So what sort of impact would you like to have? So now the circumplex is not how I behave, but how you see me impacting you. So I will say, this is what I think I do on these 10 leadership things, and this is the impact I'd like to have. You say, this is what we see you doing on these 10 things, and this is the impact we think you have on us. Read in brackets the culture that I'm developing amongst you. Okay? So if we just take the influencing, and again, the important cause and effect relationship here. So we take a data set, we look at influencing, we take the top 10% for what's called reciprocal influence. So reciprocal influence is the more positive way of influencing people, where I give you some influence, you give me some influence, we share the influence, etc. Unilateral influence, on the other hand, so we took the 10%, that's the right-hand side of the graph, the 10% that use the most unilateral. And unilateral is my decision. Do what you're told. Right? Now, one of the interesting things that came out about the research project that led to this particular tool is that actually leaders use both. That leaders, so the textbook says you should never use unilateral decision making or unilateral influence, but in fact, in a leadership role, sometimes you have to say, I've got to make this decision, and I've got to carry the can for this, right? And so leaders make both reciprocal influence, or have both reciprocal influence and unilateral influence. The key is the combination. And so here's where the graph sits. So the blue bar represents those leaders that were in the top 10% of unilateral positive influence, and how much unilateral they use. Right? And the top 10% unilateral, the green and red bar to the right, and how much reciprocal did they use? So it's not that they used no reciprocal, right? And looking at the graph, there might not be a lot of difference, but in fact it comes to that. So that the most reciprocal had used 15% more of the reciprocal stuff, but the most inhibitive or restrictive of those leaders in terms of unilateral influence used 48% more of that stuff. And this now comes down to a ratio. You've heard the expression credits in the bank kind of thing, right? This is what this graph says. But I mean, I'm a scientist, so I like to see scientific data around this stuff rather than a cute throwaway line. The top 10% for the more positive influence have a ratio between the more positive and the not so positive stuff, or was it 3.6 to 1? So every time I do it, that's my decision, and I'm going to make it. There's 3.6 times I go, well, let's make this decision together. Or let's influence each other in how we make that decision. So the credits in the bank are, every time I do one of those, well, that's my decision I'm going to have to make, you guys go, well, more often than not, he allows us to get involved. So he's got a reason for doing this. The other group, it's only 2 to 1, significantly lower ratio. Right? So every time I do a unilateral, you guys go, oh, there he goes again. Right? And the difference in culture that's created looks something like that. So we can see a direct relationship between how I go about influencing you as my team, my direct reports, or whatever it might be, and the culture that I'm helping create. So the more I use positive reciprocal influence, the more likely I am to create a constructive culture. The more I use unilateral, less positive influence, the more likely I am to create a defensive culture. Remember, that's 1 out of 10 leadership characteristics, if you like. And here's the outcome. So when people rate my impact on productivity, if I'm one of the left-hand people, I'm rated 25% more effective in impact on productivity, 41% more effective in empowering others, and 29% more effective at bringing out the best in people. Or if I'm the red-green group, then it's 29% less, etc., etc. Okay? And so that's an illustration of some scientific data. It could be as boring as batshit for some of you, but you've got to have the details. You've got to have the evidence. So a very quick illustration, this is an easy one, of indirect impact on culture. So we're a management group, we make decisions. We make decisions about how much will be centralised, how much will be decentralised, how much we let people get involved in decisions and all that kind of stuff. So here is from organisational level data. So we took again that 290 odd organisations out of the 2,000 and said, let's take the ones that have the most employee involvement and the least employee involvement. And those that have the most employee involvement had 64% more employee involvement. And there's the difference in cultures between those two groups. So we can now see quite specifically the indirect impact of the decisions that managers make about structure on the culture of the organisation. So you heard Brendan talk, for instance, about how they're devolving more responsibility throughout the organisation. It's basically this kind of stuff. And here's the difference. So the more you use employee involvement, the more motivated your people are going to be, the more satisfied they're going to be, the longer they're likely to stay, and you're going to have higher inter-unit coordination, so that integration of subunits throughout the organisation. Okay? So that's one way of looking at it, is to think of the personal stuff around leadership. That's my style, the way I think, the way I lead and all that kind of stuff. But also at the organisational level. And this is where organisations who are constructive are very mindful, are very conscious of, if we create that structure, what's going to be its impact on the culture? So we get very sophisticated organisations and very, very big organisations who are working with us come and say, look, we're going to restructure, we're going to merge 3 business units into one. And we'd like to sit down and talk with you about what we think we want to do and get your response to what you think the impact will be on the organisation's culture, because we want to make sure it has a positive impact. So the 2 propositions that I put in front of you right at the very beginning. Your ability to respond is all in your mind. And that's easy. But your organisation's ability to respond is all in the minds of your people. So what you want to be interested in is, when something happens in your organisation, what's the first thought that comes into that person's head? Because that's the culture. Thank you very much.